During the 1840s, the United States saw a dramatic increase in settlers who left their homes in the East to resettle in the Oregon Territory or California. Most wagon trains followed the Oregon Trail route from a starting point in Independence, Missouri, to the Continental Divide of the Americas, traveling about 15 miles a day on a journey that usually took between 4 and 6 months. In the spring of 1846, almost 500 wagons headed west from Independence. At the rear of the train, a group of 9 wagons containing 32 members of the James Reeds and George and Jacob Donner's families and their employees left on May 12. Within a week of leaving Independence, the Reeds and Donners joined a group of 50 wagons led by William H. Russell. By June 16, the company had traveled 450 miles or 720 kilometers, with 200 miles or 320 kilometers to go before Fort Laramie. Several other families joined the wagon train along the way: Levi Murphy, a widow from Tennessee, and her 13 family members. William H. Eddy's family. The Breen family, their neighbor, Patrick Dolan. German immigrant Louis Kiesberg's family. 2 young men named Spitzer and Reinhardt, and a German couple, the Wolfingers. On July 20, the wagon train reached the Little Sandy River. Here most of the wagons out of 500 opted to follow the Oregon Trail via Fort Hall. But here the Donner Party makes the fatal mistake of choosing a new route here. This is the story of Donner Party. Lansford Hastings, an early migrant from Ohio to the west, proposed an alternative to the Oregon Trail's standard route through Idaho's Snake River Plain, which would take travelers through the Wasatch Range and across the Great Salt Lake Desert. To promote his new route, the Hastings Cutoff, Lansford Hastings sent riders to deliver letters to traveling migrants. On July 12, the Reeds and Donners were given one of them. He claimed to found a new and better road to California and said he would be waiting at Fort Bridger and Black's Fork to guide the migrants along the new cutoff. But journalist Edwin Bryant saw the first part of the Hastings Trail, and he left letters warning several members of the group not to take Hastings' shortcut. By the time the Donner Party reached Black's Fork on July 27, Hastings had already left, leading the 40 wagons of Harlan, Young Party. Because Jim Bridger's trading post would profit if people used the Hastings Cutoff, Bridger concealed the letters and told the party that the shortcut was a smooth trip and absence of hostile Native Americans, and also shortened their journey. None of the party received Bryant's letters warning them to avoid Hastings' route at all costs. At Fort Laramie, Reed met an old friend named James Kleiman, who was coming from California. Kleiman warned Reed not to take the Hastings Cutoff, telling him that wagons would not be able to make it. On July 31, 1846, the Donner Party left Black's Fork and the company was joined by the McCutcheon family. And here they made the mistake of turning south to follow the Hastings Cutoff instead of established Oregon Trail. Within days, they found the terrain to be much more difficult than described. Hastings wrote directions and left letters stuck to trees. On August 6, the party found a letter from him advising them to stop until he could show them an alternate route. Reed, Charles T. Stanton, and William Pike rode ahead to get Hastings so he can guide the party. But Hastings showed them only part way, giving the general direction to follow. Without the guide they had been promised, the group had to decide whether to turn back and rejoin the traditional trail. But again they chose to follow the tracks left by the Hastings' party. Their progress slowed to about 1.5 miles, 2.4 kilometers, a day because they were required to clear brush, fell trees, and heave rocks to make room for the wagons. Finally, Donner Party made its way across the Wasatch Range of the Rocky Mountains. The Graves family joins them. Their arrival brought the Donner Party to 87 members in 80 wagons. It was August 20th by the time that they reached a point in the mountains where they could look down and see the Great Salt Lake. It took almost another 2 weeks to travel out of the Wasatch Range. The men began arguing, and doubts were expressed about the route. Food and supplies began to run out. Stanton, Pike, and Reed tried to get help but had become lost on their way back. By the time that the party found them, they were a day away from eating their horses. A young named Luke Halloran died of tuberculosis on August 25. A few days later, the party came across a torn letter from Hastings, which indicated there were 2 days and nights of difficult travel ahead without grass or water. The party rested their oxen and prepared for the trip. They saw ahead of them the Great Salt Lake Desert, a dry, barren plain, perfectly flat and covered with white salt. The Donner Party continued. In the heat of the day, the moisture underneath the salt crust rose to the surface and turned it into a gummy mass. The wagon wheels sank into it, in some cases up to the hubs. The days were blisteringly hot and the nights frigid. After 3 days, the water was gone. Some of the animals were so weakened they were abandoned. Some oxen broke free, crazed with thirst, and bolted off into the desert. Everyone lost faith in the Hastings cutoff as they recovered on the other side of the desert. They spent several days trying to recover cattle, retrieve the wagons left in the desert. Reed suggested that 2 men should go to Sutter's Fort in California and John Sutter could assist them with extra provisions. Charles Stanton and William McCutcheon volunteered to undertake the dangerous trip and they leave for help. The journey seemed to get easier, particularly through the valley next to the Ruby Mountains. On September 26, 2 months after embarking on the cutoff, the party rejoined the Oregon Trail along a stream that became known as the Humboldt River. The Hastings cutoff had probably delayed them by a month, and this delay will become fatal because they will soon be trapped by snow. Here the group met Paiute Native Americans, who joined them for a couple of days, but stole or shot several oxen and horses. By now, it was well into October, and the party split off in 2 to make better time. 2 wagons in the second group became tangled, and John Snyder angrily beat the ox of Reed's hired teamster, Milt Elliott. When Reed intervened, Snyder proceeded to hit his head with a whip handle. When Reed's wife attempted to intervene, she too was struck. Reed retaliated by stabbing Snyder, and Snyder then dies. Although Snyder had been seen to hit Reed, and some claimed he had also hit his wife, but Snyder had been popular and Reed was not. Keseberg suggested that Reed should be hanged, but it was eventually agreed that Reed should leave the camp without his family. Reed departed alone the next morning. Grass was becoming scarce, and the animals were steadily weakening. So everyone was expected to walk. Keseberg ejected Hardcoop, an old man who was riding in his wagon, telling the elderly man that he had to walk or die. A few days later, Hardcoop sat next to a stream, his feet so swollen they had split open. He was never seen again. Meanwhile, Reed caught up with the first group and went to Sutter's Fort to get help with Walter Heron. The rest of the group rejoined the second party, but their hardship continued. Native Americans chased away all of Graves' horses, stole 18 more, they shot another 21. So far, the company had lost nearly 100 oxen and cattle, and their rations were almost completely depleted. With nearly all his cattle gone, Wolfinger stopped at the Humboldt Sink to bury his wagon. Reinhardt and Spitzer stayed behind to help. They returned without him, reporting they had been attacked by Paiutes and he had been killed. One more stretch of desert lay ahead. The Eddy's oxen had been killed by Native Americans, and they were forced to abandon their wagon. The family had eaten all their stores, but the other families refused to assist their children. The Eddies were forced to walk, carrying their children and miserable with thirst. Margaret Reed and her children were also now without a wagon. But the desert soon came to an end, and the party found the Truckee River in beautiful lush country. But they had little time to rest. They must cross the Sierra Nevada mountains before the snow. Stanton, who had left a month earlier to seek assistance in California, brought mules and food from Sutter's Fort, and 2 Native American guides, Luis and Salvador. Stanton also brought news that Reed and Heron had successfully reached Sutter's Fort. Faced with one last push over mountains, which will get them out of mountains before snowing. If they fail to cross the mountain, then they will surely be trapped by heavy snow. It was October 20th. William Pike was killed when a gun being loaded by William Foster was discharged accidentally. Finally, the party resumed their journey, and when an axle broke on one of their wagons, Jacob and George went into the woods to fashion a replacement. George Donner sliced his hand open while chiseling the wood. Snow began to fall. The Breens made it up the massive, nearly vertical slope to Truckee Lake, 3 miles from the pass summit, and camped near a cabin that had been built 2 years earlier by another party. The Eddies and the Kesebergs joined the Breens, attempting to make it over the pass, but they were unable to find the trail because of heavy snow. They all are trapped by snow now, and it will be impossible to cross the mountains. Breen, Graves, Reed, Murphy, Keseberg and Eddy families set up for the winter at Truckee Lake. Cabins of pine logs served as their homes, with dirt floors and poorly constructed flat roofs that leaked when it rained. The cabins had no windows or doors, only large holes to allow entry. Farther down the trail, close to Alder Creek, the Donner families hastily constructed tents to house 21 people, including Mrs. Wolfinger, her child and the Donner's drivers. It began to snow again on the evening of November 4th, and the storm lasted 8 days. Now there is very little food remained from the supplies that Stanton had brought back from Sutter's Fort. The oxen began to die, and their carcasses were frozen and stacked. Truckee Lake was not yet frozen. They had little success catching lake trout. Eddy, the most experienced hunter, killed a bear, but had little luck after that. Desperation grew in camp and people made several attempts to cross the summit, but each time returned defeated. Another severe storm, lasting more than a week, covered the area so deeply that the cattle and horses, their only remaining food, died and were lost in the snow. Now the cabins were cramped and filthy, and it snowed so much that people were unable to go outdoors for days. Diets soon consisted of ox hide, strips of which were boiled to make a glue-like jelly. Ox and horse bones were boiled repeatedly to make soup, and they became so brittle that they would crumble upon chewing. People caught and ate mice that strayed into their cabins. Many were soon weakened and spent most of their time in bed. At the Donner family camp, Jacob Donner and 3 hired men had died. One of them, Joseph Reinhardt, confessed on his deathbed that he had murdered Wolfinger. George Donner's hand had become infected. Margaret Reed's family by January were facing starvation and considered eating the ox hides that served as their roof. Their cabin was now uninhabitable since they ate ox hide roof, and the family moved in with the Breens. By now Augusta Spitzer and Bayless Williams had died from starvation. Franklin Graves fashioned 14 pairs of snowshoes out of ox bows and hide. On December 16th, a party of 17 set out on foot in an attempt to cross the mountain pass. They will be known as Snowshoe Party. They packed lightly, taking what had become 6 days' rations, a rifle, a blanket each, a hatchet and some pistols, hoping to make their way to Bear Valley. The members of the Snowshoe Party were neither well-nourished nor accustomed to camping in snow 12 feet deep, and by the 3rd day, most were snowblind. The group set out again the morning of December 21st. Stanton had been straggling for several days and he remained behind, saying he would follow shortly. His remains would be found at that location the following year. The group became lost and confused. After 2 more days without food, Patrick Dolan proposed one of them should volunteer to die in order to feed the others. Eddy suggested that they keep moving until someone simply fell, but a blizzard forced the group to halt. Antonio, the animal handler, was the first to die. Franklin Graves was the next casualty. As the blizzard progressed, Dolan began to rant deliriously, stripped off his clothes, and ran into the woods. He returned shortly afterwards and died a few hours later. Not long after, some of the group began to eat flesh from Dolan's body. Lemuel's sister tried to feed some to her brother, but he died shortly afterwards. Eddy, Salvador, and Luis refused to eat. The next morning, the group stripped the muscle and organs from the bodies of Antonio, Dolan, Graves, and Murphy. They dried them to store for the days ahead. After 3 days' rest, they set off again, searching for the trail. Eddy eventually ate human flesh, but that was soon gone. They began taking apart their snowshoes to eat the oxhide webbing and discussed murdering Luis and Salvador for food. Eddy warned the 2 men and they quietly left. Jay Fosdick died during the night. Eddy and Mary Graves left to hunt, but when they returned with deer meat, Fosdick's body had already been cut apart for food. After 25 days, since they had left Truckee Lake, they came across Salvador and Luis, who had not eaten for about 9 days and close to death. William Foster shot both men, their bodies were then butchered and their flesh dried for consumption. A few days later, the remaining snowshoe party stumbled into a Native American settlement. The Native Americans gave them what they had to eat: acorns, grass, and pine nuts. After a few days, Eddie continued on with the help of tribe members to a ranch in a small farming community at the edge of the Sacramento Valley. A hurriedly assembled rescue party found the other 6 survivors of Snowshoe Party on January 17. Their journey from Truckee Lake had taken 33 days, and out of 17, only 7 survived. Meanwhile, James Reed made it out of the Sierra Nevada to Rancho Johnson in late October. He pleaded with Colonel John C. Fremont to gather a team of men to cross the pass and help the Donner Party. In return, Reed promised to join Fremont's forces and fight in the Mexican-American War. He was joined by McCutcheon, who had been unable to return with Stanton, as well as some other members. The party of roughly 30 horses and a dozen men carried food supplies. After a few days, 2 guides deserted with some of their horses, but they pressed on farther up the valley to Yuba Bottoms, walking the last mile on foot. Reed and McCutcheon stood looking up at Emigrant Gap, only 12 miles from the top, blocked by snow. Unable to cross the Emigrant Gap, they turned back to Sutter's Fort. Meanwhile, a rescue party, including William Eddy of the Snowshoe Party, started on February 4 from the Sacramento Valley. Rain and a swollen river forced several delays. 3 of the rescue party turned back, but 7 forged on. On February 18, the 7-man rescue party reached the first cabins. The relief party gave out food in small portions, concerned that it might kill them if they overate. All the cabins were buried in snow. 13 people at the camps were dead, and their bodies had been loosely buried in snow near the cabin roofs. Then 3 of the rescue party trekked to the Donners' camp at Alder Creek. Finally, 23 people were chosen to go with the rescue party, leaving 21 in the cabins at Truckee Lake and 12 at Alder Creek. After struggling on the walk over the pass, John Denton slipped into a coma and died. Ada Keseberg died soon afterwards. After several days more travel through difficult country, the rescuers grew very concerned that the children would not survive. On their way down from the mountains, they met the next rescue party, which included James Reed. After those rescued migrants made it safely into Bear Valley, William Hook, Jacob Donner's stepson, broke into food stores and overate, then died. The others continued to Sutter's Fort. Around the time the first relief party was being organized, nearby California settler George C. Yount and others then raised $500 to send out another rescue party. On March 1, this rescue party arrived at Truckee Lake. An inspection of the Breen cabin found its occupants relatively well, but the Murphy cabin was awful. Levi Na Murphy had deteriorated mentally and was nearly blind. Louis Keseberg had moved into the cabin and could barely move due to an injured leg. In a while, they found Elliot's mutilated body eaten by starving people. The Alder Creek camp fared no better. The first 2 members of the relief party to reach it saw Trudeau carrying a human leg. When they made their presence known, he threw it into a hole in the snow that contained the mostly dismembered body of Jacob Donner. Inside the tent, Elizabeth Donner refused to eat, although her children were being nourished by their father's organs. The rescuers discovered 3 other bodies had already been consumed. In the other tent, Tamsen Donner was well, but George was very ill because the infection had reached his shoulder. The second relief evacuated 17 migrants from Truckee Lake, only 3 of whom were adults. Both the Breen and Graves families prepared to go. Now, only 5 people remain at Truckee Lake: Keseberg, Mrs. Murphy and her son Simon, and the young Eddie and foster children. The rescued migrants' walk back to Bear Valley was very slow. A violent blizzard arose after they scaled the pass. 5-year-old Isaac Donner froze to death, and Reed nearly died. Mary Donner's feet were badly burned because they were so frostbitten that she did not realize she was sleeping with them in the fire. When the storm passed, the Breen and Graves families were too exhausted to get up and move, having not eaten for days. The relief party had no choice but to leave without them. The site where the Breens and Graves had been left became known as Starved Camp. Margaret Breen reportedly took the initiative to try to keep the members of the camp alive. However, Elizabeth Graves and her son Franklin soon perished before the next rescue party could reach them, and the remaining people ate the flesh of their dead bodies in order to survive. At original campsites, 3 members of the relief party stayed to help: Charles Stone at Truckee Lake, and Charles Cady and Nicholas Clark at Alder Creek. Stone and Cady took the 3 girls to Truckee Lake and left them at a cabin with Keseberg and Levi Murphy. William Foster and William Eddy, survivors of the snowshoe party, started from Bear Valley to help Reed and his group. After a day, they met Reed helping his children struggle on toward Bear Valley, all frostbitten and bleeding but alive. During their journey, they found the 11 survivors at Start Camp, huddled around a fire that had sunk into a pit. 2 of the rescuers, hoping to save some of the survivors, each took a child and headed back to Bear Valley. John Stark picked up 2 children and all the provisions and assisted the remaining Breens and Graves. After helping them, Foster, Eddy, and 2 others headed toward Truckee Lake. Foster and Eddy finally arrived at Truckee Lake on March 14, where they found their children dead. Keseberg told Eddy that he had eaten the remains of Eddy's son. George Donner and one of Jacob Donner's children were still alive at Alder Creek. Tamsen Donner had just arrived at the Murphy cabin to see to her daughters. She could have gotten rescued but chose to return to her husband, even though she was informed that no other relief party was likely to be coming soon. Foster and Eddy and the rest of the 3rd Relief left with the Donner girls, young Simon Murphy, Trudeau, and Clark. Levi Murphy was too weak to leave and Keseberg refused. 2 more relief parties were arranged to evacuate any adults who might still be alive. Both turned back before getting to Bear Valley, and no further attempts were made. On April 10, almost a month since the 3rd Relief had left Truckee Lake, near Sutter's Fort, a salvage party was organized. The salvage party found the Alder Creek tents empty except for the body of George Donner, who had died only days earlier. On their way back to Truckee Lake, they found Louis Keseberg alive. According to him, Mrs. Murphy and Tamsen Donner died. The salvage party were suspicious of Keseberg's story and found a pot full of human flesh in the cabin along with George Donner's pistols, jewelry, and $250 in gold. They threatened to lynch Keseberg, who confessed that he had cashed $273 of the Donner's money, at Tamsen's suggestion, so that it could one day benefit her children. Of the 87 people who entered the Wasatch Mountains, only 48 survived. Only the Reed and Breen families remained intact. The children of Jacob Donner, George Donner, and Franklin Graves were orphaned. William Eddy was alone. Most of the Murphy family had died. Only 3 mules reached California, the remaining animals perished. The cannibalism, although minor, has become main thing to be remembered about the Donner Party. The site of the cabins became a tourist attraction as early as 1854. In June 1918, the statue of a pioneer family, dedicated to the Donner Party, was placed on the spot where the Breen-Keseberg cabin was thought to have stood. It was made a California historical landmark in 1934. The state of California created the Donner Memorial State Park in 1927. So that's all we got about Donner Party incident, and thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please hit the like button. If you want to see more videos, hit the subscribe button, and if you have something to say, please leave a comment.